Hi guys, I predicted on social media that the UK-EU agreement signed this week will be a bit of a storm in a teacup, which will have the usual suspects ranting about small boats again by the end of this week. But before we get to that stage, one of the loudest voices during the whole saga, Brexit Hardman Steve Baker, who blocked me on Twitter, appeared on Times Radio to talk tripe. And tripe he did talk. Have a listen to this.
The UK and the EU have agreed a new relationship. We're going to find out the details from the Prime Minister at about 12:30 today. We're again weighing up giving ground over issues like fishing rights in exchange for easier access to European markets. Does it make you all feel a bit nostalgic for moments like this?
It's very clear to me from my canvassing of colleagues that there are almost 80 colleagues already who are willing to vote in the House of Commons to protest the Chequers deal. It would leave us half in, half out. It's not leaving the EU properly.
Well, that was Steve Baker, former Brexit minister, former chairman of the ERG, former Spartan, former Brexit hardman, speaking in 2018 about Theresa May's Chequers deal. There's been a lot of water under the bridge since then, including Steve Baker apologising to the EU and Ireland and then losing his seat in the 2024 election. And he joins me in the studio now. Steve, good morning.
Well, Hugo, thank you for that introduction. It is somewhat like Groundhog Day. It was a very carefully worded apology, but it did have the intended effect of resetting the relationship.
Well, if you can reset yours, anyone can. Look, here we are again discussing sovereignty, trade. The word surrender is in the air.
Yeah.
Is this exactly what you were hoping for with Brexit, or is this exactly what you were warning against?
I think it's substantially what we were warning against. I mean, we shouldn't state the case. He's not taken us back into the customs union and the EEA. The UK's trade strategy is basically established. Even this Labour government's done deals with the USA and with India. But they're making a big mistake.
There isn't a trade deal with the US. What is he talking about? We're off to a good start, aren't we? So there is a trade deal with India, but there isn't a trade deal with the United States. The deal, if you want to call it that, with Donald Trump was about tariffs only.
Which will create a massive mess here. By aligning with the EU's rules on food, on animals and on plants, by doing it through submitting to the EU's rules rather than mutual recognition, which is how New Zealand does it, that means we'll be...
Okay, let me clarify something. The reason the EU did a deal on mutual recognition with New Zealand is, can you imagine why? What's the difference between the UK and New Zealand, apart from the size of their economies? The distance, the amount of trade that takes place between New Zealand and the EU is minute in respect to the amount of trade that takes place between the UK and the EU. So the EU said, we're not going to allow, we're not going to allow mutual recognition on trade with the UK at this stage because we don't trust the UK, but also because the amount of trade that we're talking about is massive. So it would be very strange for the EU to do such a deal with the UK, which is no longer a member of the European Union. It's outside the single market, or GB is outside the single market. It would be very strange for them to do a deal like that with mutual recognition for such a large economy and an economy that does a huge amount of trade with the EU. It's a non-starter. It's nonsensical. Now, either Steve Baker doesn't know that, or he's pretending not to know that.
Breach of our trade deal obligations with like the Asia Pacific countries, with Australia, with New Zealand, which require us to have control of our own rules. The Americans...
No, look, it's about standards. If the UK wants to sell into the single market, which is its biggest market, if it wants to sell into the single market, it needs to align to EU standards. Now, dynamic alignment means where if the EU increases its standards, the UK increases its standards automatically, which reduces friction. He's talking about New Zealand. He's talking about Asian countries. Most trade is done with the European single market. It makes logical sense for the UK to align as close as possible to that, to reduce friction.
And others are likely to sue us under the trade dispute mechanisms of these agreements, and it's going to create a lot of trouble and be a real mess. And we could have gone for mutual recognition like New Zealand have done, if the EU would agree, of course. So I'm afraid it is a bit of a mess. But yeah, it's not ideal. But
he hasn't given an example of how it's a mess. He just keeps saying it's a bit of a mess. It's a bit of a mess. We could have had this. We could have had that, which of course is not true. But it's a bit of a... He hasn't given an example of how it is a mess.
I'm afraid I think Keir Starmer's done what he always wanted to do, which is effectively to sit down on the EU's side of the table. And, I regret it, but I could see it coming.
The New Zealand...
I honestly don't understand this rhetoric. Once again, I don't know if he's lying or he's pretending to lie. This idea that Keir Starmer is negotiating on behalf of the EU. He wants to cozy up to the EU. He doesn't care about Britain. Why? Why would anyone take that position? Like I said before during the Brexit saga, when you were sending negotiators to Brussels, I said you should send the best people. While Brexiteers said, no, we want to send incompetent people who believe in Brexit. And look at the result.
Deal you refer to, that's with us or that's with the EU?
The New Zealand deal with the European Union on mutual recognition in a veterinary agreement. I mean, this is the fundamental choice. Either you comply with the EU's rules and everything that goes with that, like jurisdiction.
But the UK has to comply with EU rules now. If you want to sell into the single market, you have to comply with those rules. The same way as I keep saying, if you want to sell to the US market, you have to comply with their rules. If you want to sell to Brazil, you have to comply with their rules. If you want to sell to New Zealand, you have to comply with their rules. Why is this strange? Why is this new for Brexiteers? They understand the concept of following rules. But it seems to be, well, we don't want to follow rules when it comes to the EU.
Of their court, or you play like a normal independent country and recognise one another's standards.
Once again, he's missing the point. The point here is the amount of trade. The EU is not doing a deal on mutual recognition with a country that has a huge amount of trade with it. It increases the risk. The amount of trade that's happening between New Zealand and us and the European Union is very small, so the risk is low. It's not zero, but the risk is much lower.
Be really clear here what the problem is. The problem is not...
Sorry, I also want to add, the negotiations are continuing between... It's a constant thing between the EU and New Zealand.
Not really what our rules are going to be and what their rules are going to be. They're all going to be good enough. European Union and UK and USA food is all...
It's not about being good enough. It's about ensuring that they're following the rules. Yes, the UK standards at the moment have not really changed. But in order to ensure that they have not changed, you need to carry out the checks. You need to make sure that the standards are... It's not just going on a feeling. It can't be... Well, the vibe is that everything is the same. No, you have to have paperwork to prove that.
Going to be good to eat. The real problem is that you get filthy meat coming into each of our territories that's not compliant with the rules. And if we all took a step back and said, what are we actually trying to do here is protect the public from filthy, non-compliant food, well, then we could say, well, let's focus on that.
Why does it matter if it's their rules or our rules? If they're basically the same rules, if it's not going to affect the standard of our food anyway, who cares where the rules are being drawn up?
Well, that's a very good point, because, of course, people do care what the rules are and how, because people have interests. So, for example, American beef and chicken is good to eat. I established that while I was a Brexit minister with the relevant authorities.
Which beef and chicken? It seems to think all beef and all chicken is the same. I keep saying this. There's nothing stopping, apart from a quota, but there's nothing stopping US exporters selling their beef or chicken into the EU as long as it meets the standard. If you go down to your local supermarket in the EU or in the UK, you can generally find, for example, peanut butter, especially if it's organic peanut butter, produced in the United States, because it meets the EU or UK standard. It's not that you're not allowed to sell anything. Once again, there's a quota involved, but and not all beef and not all chicken is the same. Once again, is he stupid or is he just pretending?
But, we wish to exclude it. There's a lot of propaganda about it. And American beef farmers are likely to sue us under the agreement that is struck.
No, they're not going to sue because the agreement says a certain amount of beef can come in if it meets UK standards. Like, how could they sue unless if the UK is not following the rules, then they can sue. But the rule is clear. You're allowed to sell within a quota, and it has to meet this standard. If the US farmers are not meeting that standard and still trying to sell their wares, their produce into the UK market, and the UK says no, then they don't have a case. Why is this so difficult to understand?
We exclude American beef from our markets and other markets too. So it does matter what the rules are. The point I'm making is that they have equivalent outcome, and that's what's recognised in the EU-New Zealand deal. Of course, all of this is all very detailed, but what are we trying to achieve? And for me, it's always been free trade without political integration, because for me, the EU lost democratic legitimacy when the Lisbon Treaty was used.
Okay, and then it goes on. Unfortunately, this video goes on for almost 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm not going to inflict that upon you. But it's the same old rhetoric. And unfortunately, there was no pushback here. Why is it me that's pushing back on Brexit Hardman Steve Baker? That's probably why he blocked me on social media. And calling out his tripe. He's talking absolute rubbish here. And fortunately, I don't think it's going to have much traction, because these people are not offering anything. They're just complaining. Steve Baker, Brexiteers, Andrew Neil, another one, they're just sitting on the sidelines saying it's all bad. But they're not offering an alternative. And as I said in other videos, I think this is the end. We're starting to see the end of Brexit. And of course, those who are trying to resuscitate it, trying to keep it alive on life support, are ranting and raving, throwing their arms in the air, but they're not really having an impact. The general public may not support the idea of rejoining the European Union, but they certainly hope that the UK government will operate in their best interests and try and reduce the damage that Brexit has done, the damage they can see. And I think Starmer is doing a pretty good job here. Once again, these are very small baby steps, but baby steps in the right direction. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.